Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
Hello fans of Chilling Tales for Dark Nights. This is author Meagan J. Meehan with an announcement concerning my next online horror writing class, which will begin on Saturday, March 23rd and run until Sunday, May 19th. I'm a published novelist, poet, produced playwright, and journalist who is known to the YouTube horror community as the author of several short stories, including Revelation, Jinyu, Surrogate, and more, which have all been masterfully audio produced by the Chilling Tales channel. I hold a bachelor's degree in English literature, a master's degree in communication, and I am currently pursuing a PhD in educational psychology. I will be conducting this 8-week-long class entirely online via the Wet Ink platform. Every participant in the class can expect to complete a short story in the horror genre by the end of the 8-week program. All stories will be eligible for consideration for adaptation into full class productions by Chilling Tales for Dark Nights. The stories will also be audio recorded and posted on the channel of popular Chilling Tales narrator Otis Jiry. I have included links in the description box below to stories produced in my previous classes that Otis has narrated and uploaded to his channel. Additionally, all the stories from the class will be gathered up and published in a paperback horror anthology collection via Stitched Smile Publications, who have agreed to collaborate with me and Chilling Tales on this endeavor. Stitched Smile Publications produces books in a range of genres, and while we are focusing on horror themes for this class, I will likely be launching science fiction writing classes, fantasy fiction writing classes, and crime drama writing classes before the end of 2019. All the stories from my first 2 classes, this forthcoming class, and any other horror classes I run in 2019 will be seen in print by 2020. From here on out, an anthology will be published once a year, featuring all the stories from my writing classes produced in the previous year. So for example, the 2021 edition of the book will feature stories created in the 2020 classes. The 2022 edition of the book will feature stories produced in the 2021 classes, and so on. The anthologies will be sold on Amazon, BarnesandNobles.com, and elsewhere. Moreover, an audio book will also be created based on the stories. The book and the audio recordings will be widely promoted via Chilling Tales social media platforms, Stitched Smile Publications social media platforms, and my Blasting News column, which has more than 54,000 readers from all across the globe. Anyone who takes part in the class will also receive 1 free copy of the anthology. The full price of the 8-week class, including the narrated story, anthology inclusion, and 1 free copy of the published book, is $285 per person. However, anyone who is a patron of Chilling Tales will be charged a discounted price of $265. There is a limit of 35 people per class, and payment plans are available. If you are interested in signing up, please email me at meagan@chillingtalesfordarknights.com. That's meagan@chillingtalesfordarknights.com. I will be available to answer any questions anyone may have pertaining to the class. I included links to the Stitched Smile Publications website below, along with some examples of stories from my previous classes and my own work for reference. I have also included my email address where you can contact me if you are interested in enrolling. Thank you for listening, and I hope to see you in class.
This story was produced as part of the Wicked Writing online class held by author Meagan J. Meehan. If you like this story and are interested in taking a future class, please email Meagan at meagan@chillingtalesfordarknights.com for more details. Her email is in the description box below. Enjoy the story. As Long as You Feed It, by Michaela Smith, performed by Otis Jiry. This morning, before I left for work, I went out to refill my bird feeder on the balcony. To my horror, there was blood and feathers underneath for the umpteenth time that month. As always, I briefly wondered if maybe a cat or something had gotten them, except I didn't have a cat, and my apartment was on the 3rd floor with no trees in sight. This frequent occurrence had plagued me for some time, but I decided there wasn't time to figure it out and be on time for work, so I left with a sick feeling in my stomach once again. Work was kind of hazy. I walked around in a bit of a daze as I went through the motions, putting on my apron, taking orders, etc. The diner that I worked at was fairly laid back and rarely very busy, so my almost robotic act was of no consequence. As closing time rolled around, I went into my default mode of wiping down the counter. No one was in the diner, so I continued to let my mind mull over what had kept happening to those poor birds. "Miss?" I jumped. The man who walked in and sat down on a bar stool startled me out of my daze. "Long day," he chuckled. "Yeah." I sighed and half-heartedly chuckled back, slightly annoyed that someone had come in only a half hour before we closed. "What can I get for you?" He smiled and asked, "Do you have any pie left?" Without hesitation, I listed them off. "We have apple, cherry, blueberry." "I'll take a slice of that apple pie." "Whipped cream?" "Yes, please." He smiled again. I promptly went back into the kitchen and returned with a crudely cut slice of apple pie covered with a hefty amount of whipped cream. "Thank you," he said as I set the plate down in front of him, "and I'm sorry for coming in so close to closing time." I must not have been hiding my annoyance very well, which kind of made me feel bad because the way he said it made it seem obvious that this guy wasn't a total asshole. I continued my closing duties as he ate. When he finished, he left the money for the pie and a rather generous tip and left without saying a word. "Okay then," I muttered to myself, and took care of the leftover dish, locked up, turned the lights off, and headed out the back. As I proceeded to walk out of my car, I heard a familiar voice. "Miss?" He startled me again, this time because it was dark and no one was around rather than just me zoning out. I turned around as he bent down and picked up my keys off of the ground. "I think you dropped these." He handed them to me and I thanked him. Suspicion rose in me, but before I could finish my thought of wondering why he had followed me to the back of the diner, something hard was slammed against the back of my head, and I was out cold. I was awoken by a bump in the road. "Jesus, Alejandro, slow down," complained the voice of whom I had originally thought wasn't an asshole. Alejandro, who I assumed to be the man driving, said nothing. He drove on for a few more minutes before the car jerked to a halt. I heard the rear doors open, and I was dragged out of the car by my restrained arms and forced to stand upright. The bag over my head was yanked off. I looked around frantically, but all I saw was greenery. No houses, no people, not even a city skyline. I tried to scream through the duct tape over my mouth, but it was no use. No one came. My captors didn't even try to stop me. My heart sank. I was terrified. When they turned me around, I saw a small church in the middle of the clearing. It was one of those Gothic-style churches. It wasn't as grand as a cathedral, but I still admired the design. I was dragged in its direction by a man who wasn't the one I had met at the diner. I thought maybe it had been the driver until I heard the driver's side door open. The man who was dragging me looked back and grinned at me. But unlike the man at the diner, this one made my skin crawl, and probably would have had the same effect even if he wasn't kidnapping me. "I'm glad we got a pretty one for this," he said. "Stephen," the man from the diner who was walking ahead of us warned. Stephen ignored him and pulled me close. "I'm gonna enjoy watching you scream while it rips you apart," he whispered menacingly. Not 2 seconds after trying to intimidate me, Alejandro came up from behind, grabbed Stephen, and lifted him up by the collar of his shirt. Our driver was rather tall and looked to be a bit of a brute. "Come on, man," Stephen pleaded. Alejandro stayed silent and glared at the smaller, rather scrawny man. "Are you two done screwing around?" the man from the diner asked impatiently. Alejandro dropped the scrawny and now almost trembling man on his ass. He then scooped me up in his arms and carried me the rest of the way. My quivering ceased slightly as I felt oddly safe. Well, not really, but you know what I mean. I can't really say that I liked any of these bastards, but I can safely say which one of them I disliked the least. "Hey!" I yelled to a man from the diner, but it came out muffled and incoherent through the duct tape. Alejandro painfully but quickly ripped it off, and I followed with a loud "Ow!" and then thanked him kindly. "What? Why'd you bring me out here?" I could hear my voice shaking, but I did my best to sound more angry than scared. I didn't want to give Stephen the satisfaction of my terror. "What are you going to do with me?" The man from the diner made no effort to face me and kept on as he answered. "Be patient, my dear." I cringed as Stephen cackled and said, "Oh, David, you're no fun." David opened the door to reveal a white tile floor and several rows of polished wooden pews. As we walked down the aisle, I realized how nice and well kept this place was for being out in the middle of nowhere. The stained glass windows were striking as they were lit up by the moonlight, and I briefly wondered how pretty this place must look like in the daytime. Alejandro laid me down on the altar and walked away and up the staircase on the right side. "So, now that we're all settled, would you still care to know why you're here?" David asked. "Oh, no, I replied sarcastically, although less confidently now that the big guy that had kept me away from Stephen was gone. I actually enjoyed being kidnapped and then placed on altars like some sort of satanic sacrifice. David chuckled very much like he had when I first met him. "Well, sacrifice is certainly close enough," he began. "You see, we have in our possession a rather interesting thing." He paced around the altar and continued. "We were out and about one day, never mind what we were doing. We stumbled upon a rather fearsome-looking thing." He nodded toward Stephen, who scoffed when he said, "This one pissed himself." He rested his hands on the altar on either side of my head. It was very menacing, the way it was, looking at us. When the thing lunged at us, we ran and decided to take shelter in the back of our van. Then I got an idea. He looked down at me, smiling again. "You see, we had let's call her a stowaway, in the back of our van. I wanted to be sure exactly what this creature's intentions were, so I let her loose." Stephen was off in a corner chuckling darkly to himself. As you can imagine, the things we heard and saw were rather gruesome. Steve gave me that bone-chilling grin again. "It ate her." David continued on. We soon realized that once it had fed, it didn't seem interested in us anymore, and it ran off. He paused and thought for a moment. Actually, I think I should clarify that. What it had lost interest in was eating us. The thing was interested in us, but more as a supplier. What made us realize this is that we would run into it from time to time, and since we're in the business of collecting stowaways, we'd end up presenting its food, much like we had before. Over time, we realized that as long as we fed it, it pretty much just left us alone. Stephen chimed in. "Why don't you tell her what else we've figured out about it?" "Ah," David said. "I forgot the most important part." He took his hands away and started pacing around again. "We found ourselves being followed one day after collecting our stowaway, and we don't really care to have witnesses around. I found my curiosity piping up again, so we let him follow us while we did our usual routine of feeding our new pet. Once it had its dinner, I spotted our witness in the trees out there and simply pointed in his direction. Our problem was taken care of without any hesitation." David chuckled again. "A very useful asset in our line of work." He stopped his explanation and sighed. Stephen continued for him. Unfortunately, we haven't seen our pet in a while, and it's starting to worry us. We would like it if it would continue to not eat us and do us favors when we need it. So that's what we've got you for." He smiled that unsettling smile again. My heart was trying to pound its way out of my chest. In a panic, I rolled myself off the altar, landing hard on the marble floor. I scrambled to my feet and made a break for it. Stephen started to come after me, but David stopped him. "Let her go. It won't matter." Bong! I stopped running. "What the hell is that?" I asked with a tremble in my voice. "The dinner bell," David answered. I realized where Alejandro had gone off to, and my dislike for him immediately leveled out with the other two. Bong! I looked around the church frantically. My heart stopped as I saw something moving in the corner by the ceiling. A large, dark, arachnid-like thing crept out from the shadows. It crawled down from the wall over the altar and straight down the aisle towards me. I couldn't move. As it came closer, I could see hands at the end of every black appendage, except for the praying mantis-like front claws that looked metallic and sharp. Its body and head, other than the abdomen, which was very much like a large spider's, was long, pale, almost human. The face had two human-like cloudy eyes, but no nose or mouth. I fell back as the thing towered over me, opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The thing's claws slammed down, digging into and cracking the marble floor on either side of me. It lowered its face down to mine as the bottom half of its face began to rip apart, revealing a countless number of fangs. Its mouth hung open for me as if to make sure I could see each and every one of them. The brain is a funny thing sometimes. In this moment of absolute horror and bracing myself for my doom, my mind flashed back to the blood and feathers that I had found underneath my bird feeder this morning, and the morning before that, and the morning before that. As long as we fed it. The thing was still standing over me, but it wasn't making any more advances toward me. I prayed to God I wasn't sure I believed in, and pointed in the direction of my captors. I watched as Alejandro walked back down the stairs. He screamed upon seeing the remains of his friends strewn out over the church floor, the only sound I heard him make all night. Tears were streaming down his face when he turned his head towards me in disbelief as I politely asked, "Do you think you can give me a ride home?" This story was produced as part of the Wicked Writing online class held by author Meagan J. Meehan. If you like this story and are interested in taking a future class, please email Meagan at meagan@chillingtalesfordarknights.com for more details. Her email is in the description box below. Enjoy the story.
Rain pounded against the roof of the car like a barrage of tiny fists, and another bright flash split the sky. Lori shrieked and huddled further into the massive blankets in which she had cocooned herself in the back seat. The wild wind whipped and howled against the sides of the car, moaning like a vengeful spirit trying to get into their metal sanctuary. The girl's small frame shook beneath her fluffy barrier, and she continued to whimper. "It's okay, kiddo. It's just a normal storm," Jacob said from the front, not taking his eyes off the road. In this weather, he couldn't risk getting distracted. The roads were muddy, and visibility was low, and he could not afford to lose the car, too. He could barely hear his wife's soft snores from beside him over the deluge. He remained calm and stoic in the face of nature's wrath, as no obstacle was too great for a man running solely on caffeine and spite. "It's scary, Daddy," the small voice from the back whined, muffled by her blanket, wavering with innocent fear. "I want to go home. We didn't have scary storms at home." Jacob felt the ire rising against the back of his neck and in his face, But with a heavy sigh, he brought himself back down. I know you miss home, but we can't go back. We told you that. Now quiet down or you'll wake your mother, he replied sharply. Months of stress and sleepless nights had worn his patience thin, and he worked on controlling his breathing. There was a time and a place for this, and in the middle of a storm and in the backwaters of God knows where was not it. Although, he doubted Lori could actually wake April. Even with the thunder, lightning, wind, and the close encounter with some stupid deer in the road a few miles back, she was still snoozing away, her face pressed against her seatbelt. Jacob had to wonder what demon possessed his wife to allow her neck to bend at that angle. Underneath her blanket bundle, Lori did her best to quiet down, as her father requested. She knew she had made him angry with her comment about home. She knew why they couldn't go back. And she knew talk of home made her father mad. She didn't like when he was mad. He always said really mean things and made her and Mommy cry. He had said he was sorry, but it always happened again. Lori curled into herself deeper and bit her tongue to suppress a quiet sob. She would not bother her dad with the storm or home anymore. She would try not to, at least. The family continued on in relative silence, Lori drifting off as the lightning began to fade with the passing of the storm. Jacob did his best to stay alert, sipping from his Red Bull whenever he felt sleep begin to sink its teeth into his eyes. As he finished off the last of the can with a large gulp, a mailbox came into view, and Jacob breathed a sigh of relief as he pulled onto the side road, presumably leading to the home of April's great-aunt Carla. She was truly a godsend, having offered the family her home until they could piece their lives back together. April only vaguely remembered who she was when they received the call, as she had not seen Carla since she was a teenager. She admitted that she had felt ashamed for not having kept contact with such a kindly woman, especially after the death of her husband. She regretted not reaching out at the time, and had vowed to make up for it during their stay. Jacob snorted at the thought, as if they really had time for that. The way he saw it, if any second was not spent fixing their situation, it was as good as wasted. They didn't have time for idle chit-chat. The bump against a raised rock on the road jolted Jacob from his thoughts, and he quickly refocused on driving. He reached for his energy drink again, trying to take another sip, but only a dribble escaped from the empty tin. Jacob grunted in annoyance and crumpled the flimsy can in his fist, dropping it to the floor. He returned his hands to the steering wheel, although with a much tighter grip, and a scowl upon his lips. The moist dirt squelched under the tires of the car as they finally pulled into their destination. The old Victorian-style home loomed above him, darker than the dark night it stood against, with only the glow from the windows showing that it was inhabited. Had they arrived during a sunny day, the house may not have been so foreboding. It may even be beautiful when one could see it in detail, but as it was currently presented, Jacob thought it looked like a haunted house ride, especially with the lightning in the far distance behind it. All that was missing to complete the scene were a swarm of bats and an evil laugh sound effect. It was probably for the best that Lori wasn't awake. She always spooked easily, and he really wasn't in the mood to deal with that. "Hun, wake up," Jacob said as he prodded his sleeping wife. "We're here." April stood from her awkward position, a loud crack resounding from her bunched-up shoulder and neck. She stretched as much as possible in the confines of her seat, popping more joints and rubbing her eyes groggily. "It sounded like hell out there," she said hoarsely. April smacked her lips together, the taste of sleep upon her dry tongue. She reached into the compartment between the seats and grabbed a bottle of water. The arid feeling in her mouth faded with each gulp, and she turned to the back seat once she had her refill. "How are you doing back there, Lolo?" Lori did not stir, her head hanging heavily forward as she breathed evenly in her sleep. "Oh, that position can't be comfortable," April sighed. Jacob barked out a laugh. "You should talk. You should have seen how your neck looked," he chuckled. "How it wasn't broken is beyond me." The pair laughed softly as Jacob parked the car, trying to get as close to the door as possible, hoping to minimize the dampness they had to endure. Though the storm was not as violent as it had previously been, the slow rain still came down heavily in fat drops. They exchanged a determined glance as they flung the doors open and raced to the house, practically slamming their fists against the doorbell. After a short time, that felt like a soggy eternity, the lock on the door clanked open, and the smiling, tired face of Auntie Carla appeared bathed in warm light. "Oh my goodness, my girl," the elderly woman said as she held out her arms to April. "You've grown so beautiful and strong." She kissed April's cheeks, her bright lipstick rubbing off against the damp skin. "You must be freezing. Come, grab your things quickly so we can warm you up. I will go make some tea." Carla shuffled back into the house, leaving the door open. April and Jacob immediately racing back to the car, flung open the trunk, and threw as many bags as they could inside the open doorway. Lori stirred due to the noise and the bouncing of the car, only to be picked up by her father and hauled into the house before she could even process what was happening. The car was locked up, the door was closed, and the family took their time warming up with Carla in the living room for a chat. Though half conscious, Lori's hand clung to her mother's sweater as they sat on the old love seat. The house around her creaked and moaned. The branches of the ancient trees outside scraped against its panels and window panes. Her eyes darted around, bleary and heavy. Her gaze eventually landed on the old woman in the chair across from her. Her face was heavily wrinkled, and her hands were gnarled and warped. She appeared to be missing many teeth, and her fingernails were long and cracked. Lori pushed her face into her mother's side and whined. April and Jacob talked to Carla for a while about their situation, their former jobs, and what they needed to do to get back on their feet. "Goodness, dear, that sounds awful. Makes me glad for my retirement," Carla said as she picked up her tea for another sip. "Your students must have been devastated." "Nothing brings out the best in students like their teacher leaving," April said with a sheepish smile. "Really shines a fond light on all the spitballs and drawings of dicks on test papers." Carla chuckled against her cup. "Sounds like a rowdy bunch you had." "Yeah," April sighed wistfully. "But they made me proud, you know?" An irritating tapping caught April's attention, and she turned to see Jacob rapping his nails against the cup in his hands, an almost pouty look upon his face, eyes narrowed and lips downturned in a vague scowl. His legs shook up and down as he glared at nothing. Carla had noticed as well. "Are you all right, dear?" Carla asked, clearly concerned, and Jacob visibly tensed. I'm fine, just tired," he said sharply. "I'm going to sleep. Thanks for the tea." April lowered her gaze and suppressed a sigh. This always happened when the topic of their jobs came up. As deep as Jacob's denial about the circumstances of his termination was, some part of him knew he would garner no sympathy by telling the story. His temper made holding his tongue a Herculean task, but Jacob's comment must have reminded her brain of how exhausted she was, and April suddenly felt like she could barely keep her eyes open. She looked down at Lori, who was still pushed into her side, and saw that she had once again fallen asleep. "He's right, it's late," April said as she turned back to Carla, "and Lori is already out cold." The women said their goodnights as April gently shook Lori awake. As much as April did not want to disturb her slumber, she was getting too heavy to carry. They shambled out of the room and upstairs, zombie-like in their exhaustion. Lori flopped down on the bed presented to her and barely registered the goodnight kiss as she drifted off, and April left the room to go to her own bed. Lori awoke in an unfamiliar place, in the dark of the early morning. In her hazy state, she was not entirely aware of how she got there, but she was absolutely terrified. There was an eerie sound coming from outside, like the moaning of a woman. Fingers clawed at her window and sides of the house, and the roof above her creaked with the footfalls of a terrible creature. Lori's eyes were wide as they tried to adjust to the dark, and she pulled her blankets over her head. She lay in confused terror as the noises around her continued. There was a sudden loud bang, and Lori screamed as she scrambled out of the bed to the door. She flung it open to find herself in an unfamiliar hall, where she fell to her knees and began to cry loudly. From down the hall, she heard a door slam open, followed by quick footsteps. She began to hysterically crawl backwards, away from the noise, and she shrieked as a pair of arms grabbed her. "Lori? Lolo? What's wrong?" Lori began to sob as she realized she was in the arms of her mother. She continued to cry as April picked the girl up and carried her to the room her parents were sleeping in. On the bed between her parents, she slept fitfully, kicking and stretching her body out, keeping her parents from resting. Lori awoke to a bright room, the late morning sun shining through the open blinds. Her parents were gone, and she hauled herself out of the room in search of them. She found them in the kitchen and barely registered the dead look on their faces, as she was too occupied staring down Auntie Carla, who sat in a chair at a small table, drinking a cup of tea. Carla smiled at Lori, who turned away. Lori was certain the old woman was a witch. The rest of the day was uneventful. Things were unpacked and put away, and Lori did her best to stay out of her parents' way. Consumed by boredom, she went to look around the outside of the home. In the pale autumn sun, Lori wandered out into the open area beyond the front garden. As the weather was much colder here than back in California, all the trees were either red and brown or entirely bare. The wind whipped and whirled around them, chilling Lori to the bone, even through her sweater. She shivered, not only from the bite of the wind, but from the unearthly whistle it made as it danced through the naked forest, the clattering of the branches mimicking Lori's own chattering teeth. Standing just outside the perimeter of the house, Lori noticed something that very much piqued her curiosity. A lake. Well, more like a big pond. From where she stood, the water looked as black as pitch, and it was slightly choppy in the wind. She continued towards it, seeing a small dock that went out a bit on the open water. The tip of a sunken boat peeked out of the depths next to it, still tied to one part of the rotted pegs on the walkway. The wood itself was old, splintered, and falling apart, and Lori knew better than to walk on it. The water was also kind of smelly, clearly stagnant, and green goo floated on the surface. She walked down to an area that dipped closer to the water, a sort of rocky beach covered in water-worn pebbles. Looking around, Lori picked up a flat stone and weighed it in her hand. Satisfied with its dimensions, she tossed it out, and it didn't skip as she had intended, instead just sinking as soon as it hit the water. Lori stuck out her lip and pouted. She looked down to find another stone to skip. Her next attempt was more successful, skipping twice before sinking into the murky water. Lori fist-pumped her success, but picked up another to give it one more try. Picking up another flat stone, she moved back into position, her tongue sticking out of the side of her lips in concentration. She swung her arm, and the stone sailed in a slight arc before skipping against the water 2, 4, 6 times. Lori jumped and cheered. She had never skipped a stone so many times before. Pleased with her success, Lori turned to find something else to do. But as she turned away, something caught her eye. A shape was floating towards her from the center of the pond. It didn't look like a piece of wood or some pond scum, and it looked fuzzy. Lori's eyes widened in horror as the thing came into focus. It was the carcass of a rabbit. Its belly had been ripped open, and its insides were missing. The cavity, old and brown. Lori screamed as she scrambled back up the embankment and ran to the house, where April now stood by the door, having gone outside to keep an eye on the girl. Lori ran to her mother and buried her face in her stomach. "Mom, something in the lake killed a bunny!" Lori yelled, although her voice was muffled by April's clothes. Mild disgust rose in April's throat as she thought of a dead animal in the glorified puddle. As if it couldn't get more disgusting. "All right, Lolo." April bent down to her daughter's height. "Come back inside, and I'll go deal with the bunny, okay?" Lori nodded and let April lead her into the house and put on a movie for her on the mother's iPad, before she ventured back to where Lori had been playing to find the dead thing. As she approached the lake, April's nose scrunched up at the smell. The water really did reek, but despite the smell, she could not find the rabbit. She figured it must have sunk into the putrid depths. Shrugging, she made her way back into the house, and was relieved to find Lori was fully absorbed into the Emperor's new groove. The peace did not last, as another fit occurred on the second night. The noises of the old house put Lori on edge, especially after her encounter with the rabbit's corpse, and all it took was the bang of shutters, or perhaps the house creaking, or just something Lori had imagined. She slept between her parents again, keeping them awake with her awkward positions and movements. Her parents did not complete anything the next day, as they were too tired due to the previous night. They spent their days staring blankly at the wall, too tired to be properly angry at Lori, who had opted to stay inside and watch a movie, although she soon became curious about the lake again. What ate that rabbit? Was there a monster in the lake? Or in the woods surrounding it? Lori slipped on her coat and boots and went back out to investigate the lake, shouting a quick explanation to her zombie-like parents, who merely groaned in acknowledgement. As she cautiously made her way back to the water's edge, Lori felt trepidation rising in her chest. She'd seen dead animals before, as she'd witnessed the occasional piece of roadkill, and having buried her pet hamster last year. But something about this particular rabbit filled her with a fear she could not explain. Lori wrung her hands as her steps crackled on the rocky shore, but she relaxed slightly as she saw that there was no dead rabbit, releasing a breath she had not realized she was holding in. Her heart still racing, Lori turned her eyes out to the water. It was calm today, and putrid mist rose from its surface in the cold air. A sudden ripple caught Lori's attention, and she focused her gaze on the other side of the lake. A large shape rested among the cattails on the opposite shore. It was mostly submerged, and only looked like a large lump. Lori's heart rate picked up as she took a small step back, the pebbles beneath her boot crackling together. The sound startled her into a panic, and she scrambled up the shore, not daring to look back at the shape. Lori raced into the house and bounded up the stairs, all but throwing herself into her bed and pulling the covers over her head. The stench of the mud on her boots permeated the confined, plush space as Lori caught her breath, but she had to emerge seconds later due to the smell. Now away from the lake, she rewound the events by the shore in her mind, trying to discern what the shape actually was. As she concentrated on the memory harder, the shape came into focus, as though she had reached an epiphany. But something deep in her brain was quick to correct her. The shape had revealed itself. With her newfound knowledge, and her fascination overcoming her fear, along with the head rush of the revelation, Lori left her bed, exited the room, and made her way to the shore once more. On the third night of screaming and crying for her parents, Jacob had had enough. "You will stay in this room. We need to sleep, damn it, and so do you." And with that, he slammed the door. Lori curled up in a ball on her bed, her back against the wall, as she wept quietly into her knees. As time passed in her fearful solitude, Lori got up to turn on her light. In the glow from the lamp, her fear dwindled and exhaustion from many sleepless nights took hold. Lori's stinging eyes began to feel heavy, and she drifted off into a fitful slumber. She woke up many times, but her father's wrath and the light kept her in her bed. When the sun rose, Lori was exhausted, but she had made it through the night, uneaten by monsters. As her parents were marginally better rested that morning, since Lori didn't wake them up, they began to search for work, and they threw themselves into their searches completely. In her solitude, Lori had made her own entertainment. Auntie Carla did not have Wi-Fi, and usually watched boring talk shows and news instead of cartoons. Her mother and father did have hotspots for internet, but Lori was not allowed to use it because they feared she might use all the data, and they desperately needed it. The use of the iPad for movies had apparently been a one-time deal. Her parents were gracious enough to bring a DVD player and a box of movies and hook it up to a spare TV in from the attic. It was pretty old, probably from the 90s, and was clearly what Carla used before getting her slightly newer flat screen. Jacob made a fuss about how the clunky thing almost killed him on the way down the stairs, and declared that Lori had better be grateful. With the rig set up, Lori could occupy some of her time rewatching her favorite films. It entertained her enough to keep her from pursuing her parents' attention. Aside from movies, Lori had really taken to wandering outside. After several weeks of routinely ambling around the rocky, damp, smelly shore, her parents finally took notice. April was relieved that Lori had found something to do while they were occupied, and Jacob was glad Lori was out of his hair. He was still pissed about how she had woken them up for 3 nights, and containing the harsh words he had was no easy feat. Lori's wanderings concentrated around the lake. If one went to watch her from a window, they would see her sitting on the shore, skipping rocks, collecting sticks, or just sitting there, and staring out at the water. Carla would eye Lori wearily, not wanting the child to fall in. As she was old and quite frail, it was unlikely she could pull Lori out on her own. She also remembered the incident with the rabbit. She was surprised an animal was near the lake so recently, for the carcass had to be fresh. Carla briefly mused at how long it must have been for an essentially mummified rabbit to be considered fresh. It wasn't the first time she had found an animal carcass around the property, but it had been a very long time. The old woman leaned her hand into her palm and thought back to the days when she and her husband lived in the house together, and how the lake had been crystal clear. Back then, the surrounding woods teemed with wildlife, and it wasn't uncommon to see deer grazing around the house in the early hours of the morning. The change had happened soon after her husband's death. The water of the lake became murky and began to smell. It was as though George's death had tainted the water. Soon after, animal carcasses began appearing around the property, with snouts dipped into the water, as though they had died while drinking. The bodies always disappeared quickly, most likely dragged away by some predator. Although, she sometimes saw clumps of fur, small bones, or antlers washing up on the shore. It had stopped a few months later, most likely because there were no more animals in the area. At least, there was no trace of any. Snapping out of her memories, Carla sighed. She wanted to get to know Lori better, but the girl seemed to be avoiding her. Her parents hadn't bothered to properly introduce them, and given Lori's episodes in the night, it was clear that the child spooked easily, although it made her wonder why she would return to the lake. The sun already hung low in the autumn sky when Carla called out to Lori to come in for lunch. April was passed out upstairs, exhausted from another long drive to and from what was most likely another unsuccessful interview the previous day, and Carla figured she could use the opportunity to get closer to Lori. The hunched shape did not react at first, but her head perked up after the second holler, and it came walking towards the house. The shape approached timidly, wringing its hands. "Come along, dear." Carla made her voice as mellow as possible. "Come inside for some lunch with me." Lori nodded and followed the elderly woman into the kitchen, where some sandwiches had been set out, along with a glass of juice. They sat in general silence as Carla tried to make small talk, and Lori quietly answered her questions through the sandwich. Eventually, they migrated to the living room, where Carla finally put on some cartoons, and Lori curled up in an armchair to her great-aunt's side. Eventually, the elderly woman looked over and saw that Lori had fallen asleep in the chair. Seeing just how peaceful she looked, Carla could not help but stroke the child's hair. She was a good kid, and it was a shame that she had to deal with something like this at her age, just when girls were beginning to learn about themselves. Carla remembered hearing about April and Jacob's situation when she was talking over the phone with her cousin, who had heard it from an old friend of April's father. When she had called initially, April had been very courteous and grateful for the call, but the way she had slurred her words and forgot what they were talking about mid-sentence tipped Carla off to the fact that April was drunk, which was honestly understandable for the situation she was in. April had explained their woes, how Jacob had been fired from his job due to a petty disagreement with his manager, and April had been fired a few weeks earlier due to, as April put it, parents being overprotective and entitled about their child's classroom experience, and they don't understand how stressful it is dealing with their shitty kids all day. Carla thought she had heard April take another gulp of whatever poison she had picked. Carla had offered that April's family stay with her out of kindness and affection for them as family, however distant. But seeing how the couple barely handled the responsibility of a child, or how hard it apparently was for either of them to find a job, she had to wonder if there was more to the story than she had been told. Carla continued to run her rough hands through Lori's amber locks, lost in thought. Then she too dozed off. When she came to, Lori was no longer in the chair beside her. Pulling herself from her seat, Carla made her way to the window and saw Lori once again out by the lake, skipping stones. The elderly woman hung her head as she walked back to her chair, feeling despondent. Who wouldn't, if they were rejected in favor of a stinking lake? Sitting at the table, April and Jacob stared blankly into space as they absently lifted food to their faces. April tried hard to pay attention to the words of her daughter. It must have been difficult for her to be alone all the time, and she was glad that Lori was warming to the creepy house up a bit. She really did want to appreciate the creativity and perseverance Lori was putting on display, but driving back and forth from job interviews and events and conferences had drained her of any brain capacity beyond lifting the fork to her face. Jacob could barely hear Lori over his own racing thoughts. He was exhausted, but the stress was getting to him, and his daughter's constant rambling wasn't helping. Job interview after job interview yielded nothing. He was lucky if he got an interview at all. He didn't hear back from most of the places he sent his resume to. He thought back to his job in the Bay Area and how easy it had been. The thought of it all made his blood boil, and his grip on the fork tightened.
And today, Miss Mermaid and I went looking for pretty stones on the shore.
Lori's voice drifted into her parents' ears. Miss Mermaid, April said, tiredly lifting her face, her attention directed at her daughter briefly.
Uh-huh. I met her in the lake a few days ago. She's really nice and really pretty, the child said giddily. And she brings me flowers and shells and sings songs for me and...
Lori continued to chatter about her mermaid friend. That's nice. April tapped out again, drinking the remainder of her wine in 2 large mouthfuls. Too tired to focus on her daughter's account of her mythical friend. An imaginary friend was pretty common at Lori's age, and expected considering the circumstance. If either parent had the energy to be happy for Lori, they would have. Carla simply smiled fondly at them as she listened to the young girl talk about her friend that lived in the lake. And what does this mermaid look like? Carla asked, trying to encourage Lori's imagination, and perhaps create some sort of bond. Lori leaving her alone in the chair weighed on her mind, but she did her best to ignore it.
She's super pretty, but looks kind of weird. But she's a fish lady, so you would expect her to be weird,
Lori stated, shoveling another bite of casserole into her face. Weird but pretty, you say? Carla said in an amused tone.
Uh-huh. Her skin is really pale, and she has long black hair.
Lori mimed long hair as she said this.
Her eyes are also totally black, and kind of buggy.
She sounds very strange, April piped in briefly. Are you sure she's a mermaid?
Yep,
Lori chirped cheerfully.
She has a crown of white flowers, and I think I saw a bit of a tail.
Well, I'm glad you made a friend, Carla said, smiling. A vague grunt came from Jacob's direction, and silence fell over the table again. But Lori was obviously in higher spirits than she was before. The next morning, Jacob left for yet another function. He basically had to drag himself out of the house. As he exited the domicile, he noticed a small shape by the lake in the morning mist. He approached it, wondering why Lori was out so early. As he drew closer, he could hear Lori talking to someone. "What you doing there, kiddo?" Lori spun around to face her father. From what he could see, she was building a small structure out of the damp earth.
"Hi, Daddy. I was talking to Miss Mermaid,"
she said brightly. "Ah, yes, the mermaid. And, what about the, mud castle?" Jacob crouched down to be closer to Lori's level.
"That's just for fun,"
Lori stated. Jacob glanced at his watch and got back up. "Well, enjoy yourself. Don't fall into the water. Or wander off too far," Jacob called as he moved to his car. Lori responded with an affirmation, and Jacob moved to enter the vehicle. Just before he closed the door, he heard Lori begin to talk to the water again, speaking in an excited whisper, although he couldn't make out what was said. Shrugging, he started the car and peeled away. Jacob came home around noon the next day, when the cold light of the sun warmed him just slightly. He was in a better mood than usual, having introduced himself to many people in his line of work, and hoped one would put in a good word for him. He absently glanced at the lake, expecting Lori to be there. He walked into the downstairs guest room where they had set up Lori's DVD rig, and found her sitting on the bed watching a movie. It was Finding Nemo, and the fish had just lost the goggles in the deep water. "Hey, kiddo," Jacob said as he sat next to his daughter, ruffling her hair.
Hi, Daddy.
Lori responded, not looking away from the screen. Jacob was taken aback by such a strange reply. He looked down at his daughter closely, and he had to wonder if Lori was looking especially pale today. So, what have you been up to? Jacob said awkwardly, as Lori's eyes never left the movie. The light of the anglerfish was now luring in the fish characters, and Lori's voice came out slowly and sleepily.
Miss Mermaid reminds me of that fish.
Okay, well, that was a strange statement. Your friend from the lake?
She is a beautiful light in the deep,
Lori said slowly, but with a strange reverence in her voice. And is she just as scary as the angler? Jacob asked, uncomfortable with how eerie Lori was being. She had never spoken like this before. Lori slowly moved her eyes up to her father's face, and her eyes were heavy, lidded, and unfocused.
You want to know what Miss Mermaid told me?
She asked softly. Jacob gulped and did not reply.
She said that you would still have your job if you'd actually just done it properly.
An unsettling smile grew on Lori's face as the words left her lips, but she was quickly snapped out of her dazed state by the loud yelling of her father. What the fuck did you just say? Jacob roared at Lori. What the fuck did you just say? Lori's face quickly morphed into one of fear and confusion, and Jacob continued to yell as she scrambled to understand what was happening. Did your mother say that to you? Damn bitch is talking shit behind my back. It was then that Lori began to wail loudly, and April came running in and wrapped her arms around her bawling daughter. Have you been bad-mouthing me to our kid? Jacob roared at April, who looked back at him with a confused yet unamused look, a calm fury behind her eyes as she held her child closer. Jacob felt himself getting even more angry in the face of her silent defiance, and he stormed out of the room. April continued to hug the sobbing girl and rocked her back and forth.
I'm sorry,
Lori cried.
I don't know what I did.
April stroked her hair until Lori calmed down and sat with her watching a movie. She had no idea what happened, but she would find out soon enough. By the time Nemo was back at the reef, Lori had dozed off. April dislodged her arm from under the sleeping child's head as carefully as possible and made her way back up to the bedroom to confront Jacob. What in the actual fuck was that? April raised her voice slightly, but made sure it wasn't a full yell. Why in the hell were you screaming at her like that? Jacob lifted his eyes from the floor, standing from his position, sitting on the edge of the bed. What in the fuck have you been telling Lori? Jacob growled. Excuse you? I said, what have you been telling our daughter? April scoffed at him. Why on earth would I say anything to Lori? What did she say to you? Jacob paused for a moment, as though he thought revealing the circumstances was not actually wise. His jaw clenched, and he began his deep breaths. While bringing himself down, one thing buzzed in his brain, and it slipped out before he could stop it. Do you actually think that? Jacob asked. Do I think what? Jacob paused, realizing he perhaps did not want that question answered. You know what? Forget it, Jacob finally said. I'll go apologize. I don't know what came over me. April eyed Jacob wearily as he walked out of the room, but could not press the issue further in this case. She thought of perhaps getting him anger management therapy to curb his temper, but he would probably yell at her for suggesting it. She thought back to the day Jacob came home with a black eye and the news that he had been fired. The sheer panic April felt at him losing his job mere weeks after she had lost hers, and the stressful days waiting for a warrant of assault, even though Jacob insisted he had retaliated in self-defense and could prove it. April didn't know if she believed him. The warrant never came, but that was little solace in the face of the reality that neither of them had jobs anymore and had a third mouth to feed. April sighed and sat down on the bed, trying to put together the pieces of the events. But she could not. Opening the drawer of her bedside table, she retrieved a small flask and took a big swig. The burn and the warmth of the booze calmed her nerves, but there was a slimy aftertaste of guilt and shame that followed the path of the fiery liquid down her chest.
God, this is so fucked up,
April muttered, her forehead resting against the back of her hands, one of which was still grasping the open flask. April closed the small container and hid it back in her drawer under the packets of over-the-counter painkillers and a variety of pamphlets. Deciding to leave it as Jacob suggested, April picked up her book and began to read to distract herself from the strangeness and her own mind. Jacob's eyes slowly cracked open as a sound resonated through the room. The silence that followed and the soft sound of April's breath lulled him back into slumber, until he heard it again. A loud, wet slap, followed by a dragging noise. Jacob shot up, and April groaned in her awakening. "What's up?" April croaked sleepily, her arms twisting above her head as she tried to orient herself in the waking world. "I heard something." Jacob placed a hand on April's forearm. "You stay here. I'll go take a look." He swung his legs over the side of the bed and grabbed his phone from the nightstand. His eyes burned slightly from the bright light from the screen, but he quickly switched on the flashlight and made his way to the door. April now sitting upright in bed. His light followed the wet trail down the hall, and his nose scrunched up as the smell of putrid water and mildew suddenly washed over him. His hand quickly clapped over his mouth and nose in response. His eyes watered, and his breaths came out in a shaky staccato as he tried not to inhale the stench. The smell may not have been that bad if it were not so thoroughly overpowering. Another slap, and the dragging sound echoed from further down the hall, causing Jacob to jump. His heart pounded in his ears as he realized that something was indeed in the house. He looked again at the trail on the floor. The trail of water was quite thick, and large, irregular splashes surrounded the line. Jacob took a deep breath, instantly regretting doing so, and began to follow the water trail. Every few steps, there would be a clump of green slime that jiggled as he walked near it. Along with the smell permeating the hall, the sight made him gag slightly, but his attention was refocused as another slap was heard. Louder and clearer than before. He was definitely closer now. Jacob swallowed his fear and stepped lightly as not to alert whatever was there of his presence. Another few steps. Slap. Drag. The sound was coming from just a few feet out of the range of his light, pointed in front of him, and he froze to listen. Silence. Jacob raised his light from the floor to where there appeared to be a rather large puddle in the center of the hall, the water now giving off the smell of roadkill. As the light moved up, a pair of muddy feet came into view. Jacob's heart pounded as the light shone upon the face of his daughter, soaked and covered in mud, her eyes closed. He began to approach her when she began to lift her right arm. With a sudden swing, there was a loud, wet slap as a soaked towel hit the ground. The towel sprayed Jacob with a shower of debris and water. His rage rose and was about to violently chastise Lori when she opened her mouth to speak, a smile appearing on her lips, but all that came out was garbled gibberish as Lori suddenly collapsed to the floor. His anger vanished, replaced by concern. Jacob rushed to her side and checked his child for injuries or immediate signs of illness, but Lori was just sound asleep in his arms. Jacob was no longer mad about being splashed, but more puzzled and relieved as he carried the sleeping girl back to her room and put her to bed. "Well?" April asked as he came back to the bedroom. "Well," Jacob began, "Lori seems to have become a sleepwalker, and we need to scrub the hall tomorrow." April cocked her head in confusion. "Yeah, I don't know how, but Lori filled a towel with dirty water from that awful pond and was slapping it around the hall." Jacob put his palm up to his forehead. "I don't know why she had that thing." "Maybe she soaked it during the day?" April suggested. "She spends most of her time near the water now, what with her friends supposedly living there." The next morning, as her parents scrubbed down the floor, Lori once again spent her day by the lake for most of the day. Whenever April or Carla looked out, they saw Lori standing at the shore, staring out at the water. Once or twice, she was sitting, but she did not move, and she stayed there all day. Jacob did not check, as he did not want reminders of Lori's weird antics. Once again, in the night, Jacob was awoken to a strange sound, but this one sounded much sharper, as though the surface upon which it occurred was solid. Jacob did not hesitate that night, and he quickly grabbed his phone and followed the sound, irritation replacing his previous fear. He followed the slapping sound to the end of the hall, past the landing, to one of the bathrooms. The light was off, but the sound was unmistakably coming from that room, a loud, wet slap echoing across the tiles. Jacob pulled open the door and flicked on the light. The walls were covered in smears and handprints in black, sticky mud, and the room smelled strongly of the stale water and rotting foliage of the last night. In the closed space, it was probably even worse than in the hall. The black sludge dripped down the walls, and even more pond slime coated the bathroom, along with the copious amounts of fluid on the floor. Lori was up against the mirror, absently smearing more mud on the glass, and didn't even register her father's presence until he stormed up to her and grabbed her shoulder. This time, the words were clear.
Miss Mermaid comes to the house at night, and I have to make it nice for her.
And then she appeared to snap from her daze and collapse again. She almost hit her head on the sink, but was saved by her father's catch. Previously only aggravated, Jacob was now quite spooked. In the back of his mind, a nagging voice told him that this behavior was serious, and Lori needed help, the kind of help that he could neither provide nor afford. As he carried her out of the filthy bathroom, he noticed some of the handprints on the walls seemed much too large and high for Lori to have caused them. Jacob tore his eyes from them, quickly trying to convince himself that his nerves were causing his mind to overreact. Once again, Lori was placed back in her bed, and Jacob returned to his own room. "Same deal?" April asked. "No, actually," Jacob replied flatly. This time she decided to repaint the bathroom. "Oh, Jesus Christ," April groaned. "With mud." Jacob sat down on the edge of the bed. April blinked. "Mud? Where the hell did she get mud?" "Beats me, but that is going to be a bitch to clean up," Jacob muttered before adding, "Oh, yeah, and she said that she had to make the house nice. For the mermaid." April stared at him in disbelief. "Well, that's creepy." "Tell me about it." They both dragged themselves back into bed, but neither slept well with the thoughts of their daughter's nightly episodes racing through their minds. Lori holed herself in the guest room and watched movies through all of the next day, as her parents worked to scrub the black muck off the walls of the bathroom. Carla had suggested she call a cleaner, but Jacob had insisted to clean it himself. By the time they finally scrubbed the last of the grime from the pipes under the sink, all the while questioning how it got there, the sun was already low in the sky. Dinner was quiet and awkward. Lori ate, but ate in total silence, and the stillness of the air almost made the adults afraid to break it. As soon as the meal was finished, Lori shambled up to her room and immediately lay down, although she didn't appear to be sleeping yet. As everyone began their bedtime rituals, Jacob poked his head into Lori's room, all but glaring at her. "Tonight, this door will be locked," he said sternly. It was a statement, and there was no room for argument, not that Lori tried. She let out a meek, "Okay," and with that, the door closed, and the lock was turned. Click. Jacob tested the door. It didn't budge, and he walked to his room, satisfied that he could finally get some sleep. "Why are you not more concerned by our daughter's new habits?" April said to her husband as they settled down. "She goes into these weird states when she's awake, too, so it's not just sleepwalking." Jacob made a snorting sound. He was fed up with everything, and especially Lori's new quirk. Underneath his frustration and anger was fear, although he would never admit it. He was genuinely scared by how she apparently turned into a little psycho during her fits. "What else do you propose we do right now?" Jacob said accusingly. "Drop everything and rush her to a psychologist?" April let out a groan in response. "No, but..." I feel like locking her in her room isn't really a solution. Look, Jacob started. There is nothing we can do tonight. You need to be able to function tomorrow, and I don't want to clean up another mess. He began to lean back into the bed. So just lie down and think of what we have to do when you get back from the conference. And with that, Jacob rolled over so his back was to April. The conversation was over. April pinched the bridge of her nose but relented. There really wasn't much they could do. As long as the door was locked, Lori couldn't actually wander off and hurt herself. April got into bed and did her best to empty her mind. She thought briefly about taking a swig from the flask in her side drawer to take the edge off, but swatted the temptation away, focusing on the ticking of an old clock on the dresser across the room. As April's eyes slid shut to the rhythm of the contraption, and the waking world melted away, she could have sworn she heard a rhythmic thumping and dragging somewhere deeper in the house, along with a wet slap. At the crack of dawn, April headed out. Jacob still slept quite soundly, as Lori had not been out sleepwalking last night due to the locked door. April lifted her bag quietly and left the room as silently as possible. She walked down the hall and stopped by Lori's room, turning the key to open it. The door creaked open, and April sighed at the sight inside. Lori may not have woken anyone up, but she had clearly been walking around. She was sprawled on the floor near the wall to the right of the door. As April approached, she noticed Lori was clutching her water bottle, which had clearly been emptied. Onto the floor, it seemed, judging by the puddle. April once again sighed, though slightly irritated, and she picked up a towel and placed it over the spill. She then grabbed a blanket and placed it over the displaced sleeper. April kissed Lori's temple and left the room, not locking it this time. April quietly walked downstairs and out the door and put her bag in the trunk of the car. In the dim, near-morning light, she looked over at the lake. It was just as dark as ever, and it probably still stank. Nothing stirred in the water, or near it. No animal made any noises. Come to think of it, there had never been a single bird sound near the house. The only signs of life in the area during the entire stay had been the remains of that rabbit. The realization hit April hard, but she had no idea what to do with the information. She had to get to her event, so she opted to just push the thought away for now. The sooner she got a job, and possibly got Jacob a job, the sooner they could get away from the creepy lake. Lori clearly had some weird fascination with it, so distance would probably do her some good. April pushed her foot down on the accelerator and sped off down the winding forest road, away from the home. Carla was already up and drinking a cup of tea when Lori walked into the living room. Her skin was still pale and obviously clammy, and she appeared to be having trouble breathing, her breaths coming in quickly and shallowly.
Auntie Carla, can we please go for a walk?
Lori said weakly.
I need some air.
Lori looked even worse for wear than she had the night after the sleepwalking. Dark circles had appeared under her eyes, and her skin was pale. If she did not improve soon, she would need to see a doctor. Why hadn't she been taken yet was beyond Carla. Truthfully, Carla was becoming uncomfortable and increasingly concerned with April and Jacob's parenting. Or lack thereof. All right, dear, if that will make you feel better, Carla said. She assumed that Lori felt worse in the absence of her mother and needed some comfort. They both put on their outdoor shoes and coats, and Lori held Carla's hand as they walked out of the house. They slowly moseyed around the front yard, taking in the crisp, chilly air. It had gotten substantially colder in the time Lori and her parents had been staying at the house, and the last of the orange leaves had fallen onto the half-frozen earth. Walking out of the yard onto the path to the lake, Carla smiled and squeezed her hand fondly. Even through all the troubles that brought you here, I'm glad you came, Carla said. It can get lonely out here. Lori nodded and stared out at the water as they approached the shoreline. She squeezed Carla's hand back.
I'm glad I came here too,
Lori said. But her tone was not friendly or warm, and it immediately put Carla on edge.
By coming here, I found a true friend.
Is that so? Carla laughed nervously.
Yes. and I've brought you out here to meet her. I need you to meet her in the lake," Lori said flatly, and Carla suddenly felt very cold. She felt all the color drain from her extremities as the child gripping her hand continued. "Meet her in the lake?" Carla drawled out slowly. "Miss Mermaid says she wants to take you to her kingdom. And if I help her, I get to go there and be a princess," Lori said flatly as she turned her pallid face back towards Carla. "And then I won't have to be sad or lonely anymore." Lori's lips curled into a smile as she appeared to imagine the scene in her mind. "Lori, dear, you're scaring me." Carla tried to back away, but felt the creak of the old dock under her feet, the wood damaged and ready to give out. She turned her head to look at the lake behind her. The water was calm, and as dark as ever. "Come on, Auntie Carla,"
said the child as she gripped the old woman's hand tighter. Carla couldn't help but notice how cold and clammy they felt now, and in her advanced age and frailty, she could not fight the unnaturally strong grip of the girl before her.
"Miss Mermaid says Uncle George is waiting for you,"
Lori said, with an unsettling grin on her face. Carla stiffened at the mention of her husband, and she scanned Lori's face for any clue as to her intentions. Her eyes were unfocused, glazed over, as if she could not really see what was in front of her. Her eyes looked like those of a corpse. Lori took a step forward, pushing Carla further toward the end of the dock, and the old wood groaned beneath her feet again. The child's grip on her hand was bruising, and she could not muster the strength to fight it. Carla was frightened, close to panicking. Something was psychologically wrong with this child. Really wrong. Carla continued to try to pull away from Lori's death grip as she went through what to do when she broke free. When she got back into the house, she would insist Jacob take Lori to the hospital. If he refused, she would call 911 and have the authorities take the girl. It would be for her own good. Despite her rising fear, Carla tried to maintain her composure and tried to reason with her small captor. "Lori, dear, I know things have been rough with your family," Carla began, her voice wavering from fear. "But I want to help you."
"I know,"
Lori replied.
"And that's why you need to go with Miss Mermaid."
And with that, Lori pushed Carla over the edge of the dock into the freezing water below. The shock of the cold knocked the wind out of the elderly woman, but she soon regained her senses and began to attempt to swim, flailing her arms about and desperately kicking her legs. Lori watched as Carla yelled and thrashed in the dark water.
"Please, Lori, help me!"
Carla tried to yell over mouthfuls of water, but spitting out mouthfuls of water muted her voice. Her thick hand-knitted shawl and sweater soaked up water, weighing her down, and she began to sink. She splashed frantically as each second pulled her further into the dark depths. Tears flowed from her eyes and mixed with the murky water as her head began to go under.
"Please!"
Carla garbled out as she struggled to spit out water.
"Bye-bye, Auntie Carla,"
Lori called, sleepily but cheerfully.
"I'll see you again soon."
The last thing Carla saw before her eyes sank below the water was Lori waving slowly at her. Soon Carla's hands sank as well, and all that was left was a stream of desperate bubbles. A minute later, even those were engulfed by the black surface of the lake. Lori lowered her waving hand and turned away from the lake, her gaze slowly moving to the upstairs window where her father was probably still sleeping. Sluggishly, she made her way back to the house. The gray sky opened, and rain softly drizzled on the girl, and on the now calm water. April slammed the door on her car, once again exhausted and dragging her feet as she shuffled to the door. The wind was still tonight, and she could hear the waves of the lake lapping against the shoreline. It had clearly rained earlier, as the dirt beneath her feet was soft, and probably ruining her shoes. Had she had more energy, she may have appreciated the serenity of her surroundings, but all she wanted was a glass of whiskey, and to pass out. She fumbled with the keys as she slowly made her way to the door, each step heavier than the last. With the key at last in the lock, she turned it, feeling relief wash over her as she heard the clanging of the heavy lock. She pushed the door, ready to finally rest after a long day. As she put her foot onto the carpeted floor, April felt a cold, slimy chill worm up her spine. Her drowsiness left her as she was gripped by a sudden dread. Why did the air feel so different? Why did it feel so damp? April moved into the house slowly, trying to make as little noise as possible. Every step onto the carpet let out a soft squelching noise, as it was completely soaked through with foul-smelling water. Piles of green sludge were interspersed over the floor, along with twigs and dead leaves. The air felt thick and soupy. April fumbled for the light near the coat rack, and when the light did come on, it was dim and yellow. This sickly illumination was enough for her to see the scene before her. She stared into a veritable swamp, the house flooded and filled with foliage one would find at the edge of a pond, with cattails and lily pads dotting the new landscape. Where did all this water come from? The night outside was as still as the dead, so it couldn't have blown in. April's mind thought back to the puddles, smears, and piles of muck Lori had tracked around the house lately. A sudden realization hit April like a truck, and a deeper, primal dread came to the forefront of her mind. Where was everyone? Surely they had to have noticed something. Was Lori okay? April carefully made her way up the stairs, finding them also covered in water and green slime. She gripped the banister, trying not to slip as she headed up to check on her daughter. The upstairs landing was bathed in shadow, and water flowed freely down the hall like a small creek. The smell was even thicker in the tight hall, compressed by the walls into a long tunnel of stale air and darkness. April tried to flick on the light, but the bulb did not respond. She pulled up the flashlight on her phone and shone it into the cold darkness. The light seemed to be swallowed by the dark of the hall, as though a thick, black mist hung in the air. But April's trepidation was overridden when she heard Lori's soft giggle from further into the dark. 1 foot after the other, April began her trek into the hall. The water leaking into her shoes was warm, and the stench in the air around her overpowering. Underneath the smell of old water was something else. Something like the smell of a run-over skunk, like rotting meat and musk. April suppressed a gag and quickened her pace as she could hear Lori speaking softly to someone, her feet sloshing with every step. April finally came upon one of the bathrooms, and she could clearly hear Lori's voice on the other side of the door. Faint light glowed from within, and water poured out from underneath the soggy wood. April turned the knob and flung the door open to reveal Lori sitting cross-legged in front of the bathtub in a torrent of dark water. The light from above the bathroom's mirror glowed the same dingy yellow as the downstairs light. Upon hearing the door open, Lori turned and smiled at her mother.
Hi, Mommy,
Lori said, smiling lazily up at her. Lori's eyes were glassy and unfocused. Her skin was washed out, sickly, and looked severely waterlogged. A sudden wave of terror and revulsion swept through April as she made a terrible connection. Lori looked like the reanimated corpse of a drowned child. April pocketed her phone and moved to scoop up her daughter, but halted abruptly as she saw movement from within the overflowing tub. Long tendrils of darkness began to flow along the currents, the crown of a head of dark hair popping up from within the pool. Translucent, veiny, pale skin surrounded huge, bug-like black eyes. Adorning its silky locks were the most perfect white lilies April had ever seen, untarnished and beautiful. And they glowed like the full moon on a clear night. Even with the overpowering stench of decay that radiated from the thing, their sweet scent was still distinguishable. April felt her face drain of color as Lori's description at dinner suddenly returned to her mind.
Hello, Miss Mermaid,
Lori slurred from the floor.
Have you finished talking to Daddy? Mommy is here now, too.
April forced herself to move and grab her child. Lori's skin was cold to the touch, and she shivered in her mother's hold. God, why was she so light? When had she lost so much weight? She felt like skin and bones, her flesh squished and shifted unnaturally beneath her grasp, softened and loosed from the extreme waterlogging and fluid it had absorbed. April never took her eyes off the emerging being in the bath. The creature's gaze did not waver from April as she held Lori, and soon, a taloned hand breached the side of the tub, its claws long and scaly like those of some bird of prey. It began to push its body out from the water, more of its head exposed with every second. The beauty of its face only extended to the nose, and below was a huge, toothless, stretched maw with a dark gullet that seemed to extend on for eternity. Its neck was long and serpentine, with cartilaginous ridges along its throat, where its endless esophagus would be. Behind it, a large, long lump of twisted flesh thrashed about against the basin, covered in malformed fins and what looked to be small, undeveloped arms. The thing continued to hoist itself from the bath on freakish, elongated limbs, its claws scraping against the porcelain. And as its torso began to come into view, April's instincts kicked into overdrive, and she turned on her heel and ran out of the bathroom faster than she had ever run. She heard the thing screech behind her, and the bathtub slosh and groan as it slipped out. She could hear it dragging itself along the floor, its hands slapping down against the wet floor, and she remembered all those nights where she thought the noises in the halls were just Lori sleepwalking. In the dark, without the light on her phone, April prayed that she would not slip and fall, that she would find the stairs, that the thing moaning and dragging itself in the dark behind her, slowly making its way towards her, would not prevail. April continued to run, but the weight of her daughter was making it hard to maintain her pace, and she had to slow to catch her breath. As she panted and clung to Lori, the splashing in the distance ceased. The silence that followed was deafening. Each breath April and Lori took sounded as loud as thunder, the rush of water around her making it hard to discern if there was any movement. April continued slowly through the hall, the faint light from the entry of the house finally peeking at the end of the hall. Before relief could even be felt, April saw a shape begin to emerge from the water situated on the floor of the landing. She could see the outline of its body in the light, and beside its long arms appeared to be another, shorter pair of arms, and they were holding something. The monstrosity cocked its head and raised what it was holding up to be seen. Backlit by the light of the entry, April held back a horrified scream and a gag as she realized that it was a human arm. It was Jacob's arm. The twisted thing moved the arm up into its cavernous mouth and shoved the limb in, swallowing it whole. April held in her desperate weeping, staggering back as the thing slowly sunk back to the floor. It had done that display just to taunt her, to break her spirit, to make her easier prey. April would have dropped to her knees had the weight of Lori in her arms not brought her back to reality. She heard something moving in the water directly behind her, slowly slipping through, and panting heavily, hungrily. April took off again as she felt rotten breath against her neck and the light brush of an arm on her back. The creature groaned from the dark as April sprinted as hard as she could into the dim light and practically flew down the stairs. Her heel slipped against the slime on one of the stairs, and she slammed into the steps hard. A sharp, deep pain shot up her spine on impact, and she struggled to lift herself again, the strain of carrying Lori causing excruciating pain in her lower back. She could hear thumping along the stairs above her and forced herself to move as fast as she could in her current state, her back throbbing, nausea beginning to overtake her. She crossed the threshold of the door and continued to hobble to her car, the creature behind her able to finally keep up with her slowed pace. It groaned and moaned as it dragged its unnatural form closer to the limping woman, drawing even closer, its second set of arms reaching out to claim its next victim. April hissed as she held Lori in one arm, grabbed the car door, and threw both herself and her child in, slamming and locking the car behind her. As April lay on the seat, shaking in agony and terror, the thing slapped its hands on the window, pond scum flying off with each impact. It keened angrily as it circled the car, trying to slip its fingers in to gain entry, looking to Lori for something. Lori had long since passed out, and its talons could not find purchase to claw open the window or doors, nor try to smash the glass. Its black, enormous eyes showed no emotion, Its jaw loose and hanging showed no change, but it lowered its hands from the car and began to slink further back. April sat up to watch it retreat, but it had already gone. Whether back into the house or into the lake, she was not sure, but she did not want to find out. April crawled into the front seat with great difficulty and pain. Something in her lower back clicked as she moved, and April gritted her teeth as she sat down. She looked back at her daughter and saw that the color was still absent from her cheeks, and she looked like a mess, sporting deep bags under her eyes and blue lips. Her clothes were soaked, her skin smudged with dirt, and strands of green goo clung to her hair. April's throat tightened as she turned away, fumbling with her keys. She turned them in the ignition, and the engine roared to life. She began to pull away from the now accursed home, shivering in fear and pain as the adrenaline began to wear off, and she desperately hoped she would not pass out on her way to the nearest town. She glanced into her rearview mirror a final time as the car began down the forested path from the old home and caught a glimpse of the silhouette of a head on a serpentine neck, backlit in one of the house's windows. As suddenly as it had appeared, it sunk down from its position, out of sight. April's eyes darted back to the road quickly, not wanting to acknowledge the reality of the horrible situation. In her single-minded focus, she did not notice the heaviness building in her eyes as a soft, deep melody wafted into her ears. Nor did she realize that Lori was now upright, her eyes still unfocused, a wide but dreamy smile on her lips as the car began to swerve and skid on the soaked, slimy earth. Scaly, ancient hands pulled a small, battered frame from the pile of twisted metal. As the being lifted the small frame into the scaly arms and up towards its endless, unfathomable maw, Lori turned her head to look at her mother. Although her mother appeared to be staring at her, April's empty eyes did not see anything anymore, as the branch of a tree had smashed into her head. As the warm darkness began to enclose around one of her limbs, Lori had to agree with Daddy that it really was amazing how her mother's neck could bend like that.
Chilling tales for dark nights.